This is Livy, Book 9, where he talks about Alexander the Great. Indeed, people regard him as one who might have been a match in generalship for Alexander the Great, if the latter, after subjugating Asia, had turned his arms against Europe. Nothing can be thought to have been more remote from my intention since I first set about this task than to depart unduly from the order of events and to aim by the introduction of ornamental digressions at providing, as it were, agreeable bypaths for the reader and mental relaxation for myself. Nevertheless, the mention of so great a prince and captain evokes certain thoughts which I have often silently pondered in my mind, and disposes me to inquire how the Roman state would have fared in a war with Alexander. It appears that in war, the factors of chief importance are the numbers and valor of the soldiers, the abilities of the commanders, and fortune, which, powerful in all the affairs of men, is especially so in war. These factors, whether viewed separately or conjointly, afford a ready assurance that even as against other princes and nations, so also against this one, the might of Rome would have proved invincible. First of all, to begin by comparing commanders, I do not deny that Alexander was a remarkable general. Still, his fame was enhanced by the fact that he was a sole commander, and the further fact that he died young, in the flood tide of success, when as yet he had experienced no other lot. Not to speak of other distinguished kings and generals, illustrious proofs of human vicissitude. What else was it but length of days that exposed Cyrus, whom the Greeks exalt so high in their panegyries, to the fickleness of fortune? And the same thing was lately seen in the case of Pompey the Great. Need I repeat the names of the Roman generals, not all nor of every age, but those very ones with whom, as consuls or as dictators, Alexander would have had to fight: Marcus Valerius, Corvus, Gaius Marcius Rutulus, Gaius Sulpicius, Titus Manlius Torquatus, Quintus Publius Philo, Lucius Papirius Cursor, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the two Decii, Lucius Voluminus, Manius Curius. After these come some extraordinary men. If he had turned his attention to war with Carthage first and later with Rome, and had crossed into Italy when somewhat old, any one of these was as highly endowed with courage and talents as was Alexander, and military training handed down from the very beginning of the city had taken on the character of a profession built up on comprehensive principles. So the kings had warred, so after them the expellers of the kings, the Junii, the Valerii, and so in succession the Fabii, the Quinctii, Cornelii, and Furius Camillus, whom in his old age those had seen as youths, who would have had to fight Alexander. But in the performance of a soldier's work in battle, for which Alexander was no less distinguished, Manlius Torquatus or Valerius Corvus would, forsooth, have yielded to him, had they met him in a hand-to-hand encounter, famous though they were as soldiers before ever they won renown as captains. The Decii, of course, would have yielded to him, who hurled their devoted bodies upon the foe. Papirius Cursor would have yielded, with that wondrous strength of body and spirit. The counsels of a single youth would no doubt have got the better of that Senate, not to speak of individual members, which was called an assembly of kings by him who, before all others, had a true conception of the Roman Senate. And I suppose there was the danger that Alexander would display more skill than any of these whom I have named, in selecting a place for a camp, in organizing his service of supply, in guarding against ambuscades, in choosing a time for battle, in marshaling his troops, in providing strong reserves. He would have said it was no Darius whom he had to deal with, trailing women and eunuchs after him, and weighed down with the gold and purple trappings of his station. Him he found a booty rather than an enemy, and conquered without bloodshed, merely by daring to despise vain shows. Far different from India, far different from India, through which he progressed at the head of a rout of drunken revelers, would Italy have appeared to him, as he gazed on the passes of Apulia and Lucanian mountains, and the still fresh traces of that family disaster wherein his uncle, King Alexander of Epirus, had lost his life. And we are speaking of an Alexander not yet overwhelmed with prosperity, which none has ever been less able to bear. For viewing him in the light of his new fortune, and of the new character, if I may use the expression, which he had assumed as conqueror, he would evidently have come to Italy more like Darius than like Alexander, at the head of an army that had forgotten Macedonia and was already adopting the degenerate customs of the Persians. I am loath in writing of so great a prince to remind the reader of the ostentatious alteration in his dress, and of his desire that men should prostrate themselves in adulation, a thing which even conquered Macedonians would have found oppressive, much more than those that had been victorious, of his cruel punishments and the murder of his friends as they drank and feasted, of the boastful lie about his origin. What if his love of wine had every day grown stronger, and his truculent and fiery anger? I mention only things which historians regard as certain. Can we deem such vices to be no detraction from a general's good qualities? But there was forsooth the danger, as the silliest of the Greeks, who exalt the reputation even of the Parthians against the Romans, are fond of alleging that the Roman people would have been unable to withstand the majesty of Alexander's name, though I think that they had not so much as heard of him, and that out of all the Roman nobles, not one would have dared lift up his voice against him, although in Athens, a city crushed by the arms of Macedonia, at the very moment when men had before their eyes the reeking ruins of the neighboring Thebes, they dared inveigh against him freely, as witnessed the records of his speeches. However imposing the greatness of the man may appear to us, still this greatness will be that of one man only, and the fruits of little more than 10 years of success. Those who magnify it for this reason, that the Roman people, albeit never in any war, have yet suffered defeat in a number of battles, whereas Alexander's fortune was never aught but prosperous in any battle, fail to perceive that they are comparing the achievements of a man, and a young man too, with those of a people that was now in its 400th year of warfare. Should it occasion us surprise if, seeing upon the one side, are counted more generations than are years upon the other. Fortune should have varied more in that long time than in a life of 13 years. Why not compare a man's fortune with a man's, and a general's with a general's? How many Roman generals could I name who never suffered a reverse in battle? In our annals and lists of magistrates, you may run through pages of consuls and dictators of whom it never on any day repented the Roman people, whether of their generalship or fortune. And what makes them more wonderful than Alexander or any king is this: some were dictators of 10 or 20 years, and none held the consulship above the year. Their levies were obstructed by the tribune of the plebs. They were late in going to war, and were called back early to conduct elections. In the midst of their undertakings, the year rolled round. Now the frowardness of a colleague occasioned them losses or difficulties. They succeeded to affairs which others had mismanaged. They received an army of raw recruits, or one badly disciplined. Now consider kings Not only are they free of all impediments, but they are lords of time and circumstance, and their counsels carry all things with them, instead of following their train. So then, an undefeated Alexander would have warred against undefeated generals and would have brought the same pledges of fortune to the crisis. Nay, he would have run a greater risk than they, inasmuch as the Macedonians would have had but a single Alexander, not only exposed to many dangers, but incurring them voluntarily, while there would have been many Romans a match for Alexander, whether for glory or for greatness of their deeds, or for whom each several one would have lived and died as his own fate commanded, without endangering the state. It remains to compare the forces on both sides, whether for numbers or types of soldiers, or size, or of their contingents of auxiliaries. The quinquennial enumerations of that period put the population at 250,000. And so, at the time, when all the Latin allies were in revolt, it was the custom to enroll 10 legions by a levy which was virtually limited to the city. In those years, frequently 4 or 5 armies at a time would take the field, in Etruria, in Umbria, where they also fought the Gauls, in Samnium, and in Lucania. Later on, Alexander would have found all Latium, with the Sabines, the Volsci, the Aequi, and all of Campania, and a portion of Umbria and Etruria, the Picentes, and the Marsi, and the Paligni, and the Vestini, and the Apulians, together with the whole coast of the lower sea held by the Greeks, from Thurii as far as Naples and Cumae, thence all the way to Antium and Ostia. All of these, I say, would have found either powerful friends of the Romans or their defeated enemies. He himself would have crossed the sea with veteran Macedonians to the number of not more than 30,000 foot and 4,000 horse, mostly Thessalians, for this was his main strength. If to these he added Persians and Indians of other nations, he would have found them a greater burden to have dragged about than a help. Add to this that the Romans would have had recruits ready to call upon, but Alexander, as happened afterwards to Hannibal, would have found his army wear away while he warred in a foreign land. His men would have been armed with targets and spears, the Romans with an oblong shield affording more protection to the body, and the Roman javelin, which strikes on being thrown with a much harder impact than the lance. Both armies were formed of heavy troops keeping to their ranks, but their phalanx was immobile and consisted of soldiers of a single type. The Roman line was opener and comprised more separate units. It was easy to divide whenever necessary and easy to unite. Moreover, what soldier can match the Roman in entrenching? Who is better at enduring toil? Alexander would, if beaten in a single battle, have been beaten in the war. But what battle could have overthrown the Romans, whom Caudium could not overthrow, nor can I? Nay, many a time, however prosperous at the outset of his enterprise might have been, would he have wished for Indians and Persians and unwarranted Asiatics, and would have owned that he had before made war upon women, as Alexander, king of Epirus, is reported to have said when mortally wounded, contrasting the type of war waged by this very youth in Asia with that which had fallen to his own share. Indeed, when I remember that we contend against the Carthaginians on the sea, and 24 years, I think that the whole life of Alexander would hardly have sufficed for this single war. And perchance, inasmuch as the Punic state had been by ancient treaties leagued with the Roman, and the two cities most powerful in men and arms might well have made common cause against the foe whom they dreaded, had he been crushed beneath the simultaneous attacks of Rome and Carthage. The Romans have been at war with the Macedonians, not to be sure when Alexander led them, or their prosperity was unimpaired, but against Antiochus, Philippus, and Persis, and not only without ever suffering defeat, but even without incurring any danger. Proud word I would not speak, but never, and may civil wars be silent, never have we been beaten by infantry, never in open battle, never on even, or at all events on favorable ground, cavalry and arrows, impassable defiles, regions that afford no road or convoys, may well occasion fear in heavy armed troops. 1,000 battle arrays more formidable than those of Alexander and the Macedonians have the Romans beaten off, and shall do, if our present love of domestic peace endure, and our concern to maintain accord. That's Livy, Book 9.